Chapter 17. Beneath Hay and Feed Stacks. The next evening, the widow tailor came around to the cellar door. We heard the creaking of the wagon wheels and her voice talking to the horse. "Now, Jupe, you listen to me. Move up, Jupe. You are not going over there. You stop right here. Whoa, Jupe." The horse snorted loudly outside. "Don't toss your head at me, old fella," she scolded, "because I won't stand for it." The cellar door opened. "Come out of there now," the widow lady called to us sharply. "I'm here with the wagon." Me and Harrison were already waiting for her. We had spent the whole day going up and down them steps every little while to see if the sunlight was still shining through the cracks around the cellar door. "Ain't it dark yet?" Harrison kept asking. "Where do you think that lady is?" His rigor mortis had set in again, so most of the afternoon he stayed piled up in the coverlets, and twice he had me poke around the cellar looking for an old axe to put underneath the straw tick so he could keep the chills away. But finally, the widow lady had come with the wagon, and me and Harrison left that cellar fast. After 2 days in darkness, we hurried up them steps and stood outside, trying to get our eyes used to seeing the light. The sun was setting just below the far trees, and the air smelled of wood smoke and warm earth. I breathed in a whole lungful of that good air, as if I had never taken a living breath before. "Over here," the widow lady had said impatiently. She stood at the front of an old-looking brown horse with her fingers curled around the bridle. His head swung up and down, blowing a snort of air. "You be still, Jupe." She gave him a soft slap on the neck. "He doesn't like coloreds much, as you can tell," she said. But in my mind I thought maybe the truth was he didn't like widow lady much, because she was the one holding tight to his bridle, not us. "Climb in," she said, pointing to the wagon. "Jacob always puts the colors in the back, underneath the hay and the feed stacks. Just be careful of his good things." I don't know what that lady meant about Jacob's good things. The wagon was a mess of tools, barrels, cordwoods, and clumps of dirty hay, just like the cellar. There was nothing fancy or nice at all. "You go in and hide yourself right there," Harrison whispered, shaking out a pile of old toe sacks. Shriveled up old apples rolled everywhere. "I'm going to hide myself under this pile of hay." He leaned closer. "Anything happens, if we get stopped along the way, you just stay covered up right there. And you don't breathe a word. You let Harrison do what needs to be done. You understand?" The widow lady came around the side of the wagon. "I'm ready to leave," she said loudly. "It's getting late." "All right, yes, I'm hurrying," Harrison said. "Go on, get underneath that feed sack, Samuel." He lifted his sack and gave me a hard stare. There wasn't a thing I could do but crawl underneath that scratchy pile that smelled like earth and rotten apples. "The ladies have a prayer meeting and hymn singing every Thursday evening and at Reverend Price Church," the widow lady told Harrison. "Last week Jacob rode around the wagon and watched over the troop until we had finished our meeting. He told me everything sounded so sweet and nice." Shiver went through me, hearing the way the widow lady kept talking so real about her dead husband. "Did you see Jacob while you were down in that cellar last night?" she asked Harrison. "Did he talk to you?" "Well, no," Harrison said, coughing. "We didn't. No. We've been sleeping pretty sound, though." "I talked to Jacob last night, and he said he was going to have a look at you. I said you was an old colored man with a young boy. Are you certain you didn't speak to him?" I recollected how she had cried and sobbed that night before, and there weren't any other voices, not Jacob's or any others. "Could be that we did," Harrison answered uneasily. "My husband's a good man, isn't he?" "Yes, Harrison's muffled reply. "That's the truth." "Now, once we get to Reverend Price Church, all you will need to do is climb out of the wagon after the hymn singing starts, and go round to the side door of the church, the one that is next to the big currant bush. Do you know what currants are?" "Yes, Harrison answered again, and I thought about the big currant bush that grew in the back of Lily's cabin, full of sour red blackberries. "Ain't that a picture of life?" Lily used to say, chuckling every time we walked by it. "Good-looking berries that be sour and stuck with thorns." Miss Taylor kept rattling on. "You and the boy will have to sneak through the church door by those currant bushes, and after that Reverend Pry will find you, and he'll take good care of you. He's saved dozens of coloreds." Then there was a pause, and the wagon creaked, as if the widow lady was climbing up to her seat. I heard the sound of the reins being loosened and untangled. "Ready, then?" she asked Harrison. I didn't hear Harrison's answer, but the wagon jolted forward after that, and we were on our way. I curled my fingers around my mama's gray yarn in my pocket. Strange to say, I had never seen a real church before. Chapter 18. Oh, our poor colored brethren. The widow Taylor talked up a storm of nonsense to her dead husband all the way to the church. Even hidden underneath the feed sacks, I could hear her talking. "Jacob," she'd say, stopping the wagon suddenly, "climb down and see if there's a snake curled up in the road, would you please?" And another time, when the wagon's wheel stuck fast in the rut, she said, "Jacob, would you be so kind to put that rail underneath the left wheel?" But I could hear her heaving and sighing and climbing down from the wagon seat and put the plank underneath the wheel herself. With all that stopping and starting and getting stuck, it seemed like the road we took was more than a week long. Underneath the feed sacks, my skin itched, and I could hardly breathe from the smell of those spoiled apples. When we stopped for the last time, it was nearly dark outside. Harrison crawled over and lifted up the feed sack. "Get it moving, Samuel." In the front of the wagon, I saw a good-sized building made of white bricks. Looked like little blocks of salt set one top one another right up to the sky. 3 skinny long windows faced into the dusk, and there were candles flickering in the panes. From one open window, the sound of thin, unsteady singing drifted out. "Hurry, Samuel," Harrison said sharply. "That widow lady's already gone inside." But it was a strange feeling to climb out of the wagon and creep up to that fancy white folks' church. Me and Harrison moved along the side of Miss Taylor's wagon and horse, then along the side of another wagon, keeping real low. The horses tied in the yard moved and nickered uneasily. Wagon trace chains jangled in the darkness, and I had the suspicion that when we got to the door of the church, a whole group of white patrollers was going to jump out in the shadows, and the church building would crumble to nothing more than a pile of salt at our feet. But the only thing that happened was that Harrison couldn't get the side door open. It was stuck closed. "Well, now," Harrison looked up at the night sky and then out of the yard full of wagon horses. "That mean we go or stay out?" He shook his head. "Lord ain't saying much this evening, is he, Samuel?" Putting his shoulder against the door, Harrison gave it one last shove, but this time it swung open so suddenly it nearly sent both of us sprawling. We were in a small room, but it looks as if the room belonged to a rich white fellow because it was full of fancy things. On a shiny wood table nearby, I could see books, quills, and papers scattered in the light of 2 oil lamps. And me and Harrison ducked down behind the table, fearing that we made enough noise to wake the dead. But the room stayed empty. No one came barreling in after us. Harrison straightened up slowly, shook his head. "Lordy, lordy," he sighed. On the table, something caught my eye. A powerful big book sat in the middle like a split-open piece of tree trunk. I leaned over to look at it. Words filled the whole page of one side, thick as weeds, and on the other side was an ink drawing so real it seemed as if it would come alive. The drawing showed 2 white folks with wings flying over an old man with a long beard. His eyes stared up at them in a frightened way, and the flying white folks reached out of the sky toward him. Their hands looked like such soft human hands that I had to touch the page to make sure they weren't. "Never seen a book that size before," Harrison whispered, coming out. "Looks like something straight from the Lord himself." "Is that a white folks' Bible?" I asked Harrison. "Could be. Looks that way." I trailed my fingers down the page of the words. "Nothing like Lily's Bible," I said. "Course not," Harrison snorted. "White folks got their fancy Bible, we got ours." On the other side of the wall, the ladies' thin voices kept singing. Harrison grinned. "Sounds like a fiddle on its last string. And even the little string ain't in tune, sure enough." He slapped his leg and shook his head back and forth in a silent laughter. The poor singing trailed off after that, and there was a sound of the church ladies making their way out of the church. Me and Harrison hunched down behind the table and listened to all the footsteps. Quick footsteps, shuffling footsteps, starting and stopping footsteps. After the footsteps died away, the doors of the room swung open. "Blessed be those who fear the Lord," a loud voice came, and when I raised my eyes above the table, I half expected to see the Lord himself standing there with the robes and wings just like that Bible picture. What I saw instead was a short, white-haired man standing in the doorway with an odd-looking younger fella. "I'm Reverend Pry," the old man said, moving toward us with a quick cricket steps. "Welcome, my poor brethren." The Reverend pointed to the other fella. "And this is my student, Mr. Keephart. Don't be timid about this, Mr. Keephart. Come forward." Mr. Keephart was skinny as a broom straw, with buck teeth the size of Seth's dominoes, but it seemed to me that the teeth smiled in a friendly way at us. The Reverend peered at me over his spectacles. "I imagine you must be Samuel, the Negro boy who ran away from your owner in Blue Ash, Kentucky last Saturday evening?" The skin on my neck prickled. How did he know my name and where we had come from? "And," he turned to Harrison, "you must be old Harrison, about 70 years of age, very lame and slow, as his master says." The Reverend's sharp black eyes stared at us, unblinking. "Is that who both you are? Am I correct?" Harrison didn't say a word. My heart hammered in my ears. "I expect honesty in all things. There's no room for a dishonest man in the Lord's house." The Reverend rapped his knuckles on the table. "Speak up." "Yes," Harrison answered low and mumbled. "Me and Samuel, that is." "Lord rewards the honest man and strikes down all others," the Reverend said, sitting down at the table and picking up a quill. "Remember that." The room was quiet. Standing there, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think about strangers who knew things about us that we hadn't even said yet. Had we been caught? Harrison cleared his throat. "How come you know our names? Someone been going around asking for us?" Reverend Pry sharpened the end of his quill with a penknife. "There were 3 Kentucky folks in town yesterday afternoon on the trail of their runaway slaves," he said, without looking up. "Mr. Keephart talked to an older dark-haired gentleman with 2 sons. One was a strapping big fella, another one was red-haired and young." My throat tightened. Cassius and Seth. "They were placing notices about the escape of their old man and about an old man and a boy in the newspaper and such." The Reverend held his quill to the light. "Their name was Hackler, Mr. Keephart heard them say." Harrison jumped in. "They still here?" He looked wild-eyed around the room. "You seen them today?" Mr. Keephart shook his head. "No." And the Reverend Pry sniffed and peered at Harrison over the top of his spectacles. "There's nothing to fear in the Lord's house," he said. "The Lord always shields the persecuted." But the Reverend didn't know Mr. Hackler. He was something to fear, all right, persecuted or not. He and Cassius both. When one of them hunting dogs had run off, they tracked it all the way down to the next town. He was the kind who would turn over every rock until he found what he was looking for. "Come closer, Samuel." The Reverend turned up his lamp until the flame flickered out at the top. "Tell me your age." Harrison reached out and wrapped his hands tight around my arm. "Samuel's 11 years. Come spring, he's going to be 12. "Samuel, 11 years of age," the Reverend repeated with his quill pen. He made marks on the piece of paper. Looked just like a long line of spider webs. "Does he have a mother?" the Reverend asked Harrison, as if I didn't have a voice left to talk. Harrison shook his head. "Sold off." The Reverend clicked his tongue and gave Mr. Keephart a look. "Poor young fella," he said, and his pen scratched across the paper. Then he told me to step closer, and he gave me a long, silent stare. I was afraid he could see every thought in my head. How he was had the skinniest white nose I'd ever seen. How his bristly eyebrows looked like 2 rolls of cotton stuck above his eyes. How I didn't like being in the strange white folks' church at all. How I wanted him and Mr. Keephart to go on and leave us be. The Reverend leaned over his paper, and his ink pen scratched words all over. Scratch, 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 scratch. Sounded like hens in a chicken yard. I was sure he was writing down all my bad thoughts, one after another, and I couldn't keep still any longer. "What you writing down on that paper?" I asked. Setting the paper pen in the inkwell, the Reverend said, "Well, I'm just putting down a little store for my congregation." And then he picked up a paper and read, clear as anything. "Our 4th to 5th Visitor was a boy named Samuel, 11 years of age, light chestnut-colored skin, features good, wide awake, well made, but he speaks little, the way children often do in bondage. Samuel ran away from his Kentucky master, who caused him to suffer severely by selling off the boy's own mother when he was only a small child. He appears to be of good moral character and traveled north with an aged slave named Harrison. It felt awful strange listening to the Reverend tell a story about me, as if I wasn't even standing right there. Samuel this and Samuel that, as if he had raised me the same Harrison Lilly had done. Truth is, no one had ever written one word of ink about me before. White folks did their writing about white folks, and black folks didn't have any use for writing, so I didn't see why the Reverend would bother to write straw about me. All the same, it made me feel like I had turned into white folk and grown about 2 feet tall to hear him go on like that. But Harrison's hand pulled me back hard out of the Reverend's lamplight. "Why you writing about Samuel? We don't read none," he said, cutting his eyes at the Reverend and Mr. Keephart. The Reverend straightened his spectacles and tugged on the black cravat round his neck as if it had grown too tight. "As I told the boy, I write the stories for my congregation." "Don't believe a word of that," Harrison snorted. "No, I don't. No white folks in their right minds want to hear a story of poor black folks. No, sir, they don't." "Oh, but they do." All of us turned to Mr. Keephart, who finally spoke a word. "The Reverend tells them about the trials and despair that are rescuing our poor colored brethren from, and the members of our congregation, even some who are sons and daughters of slave-owning families in the South, are brought down to tears." Harrison pressed his lips together. "Don't make one bit of sense to me." "They see the humanity." The Reverend waved his quill in the air and dropped the ink splattered on the table. "In poor colored brethren like yourselves, I tell my congregation that the Lord worketh his will in all things, and if we do such acts of benevolence to the poorest of us, we do them to the greatest." I had never heard anyone rattling on the way Reverend Pry did. It made no sense at all, the way he talked, using the strangest words I'd ever heard, while waving his arms around like those white folks flying away in the Bible. Still, I figured that whatever he was writing down on that paper wasn't meant to bring any trouble, because Mr. Keephart smiled and nodded, even though Reverend Pry didn't let him get more than a word in. Harrison gave the Reverend a long look, like he was thinking things over, and then he pulled a chair close to the table and said, "Say you write something down on that paper," he tapped the paper with his finger, "about me." But Reverend Pry pushed his chair back and stood up. "I'm afraid that the hour's late and I have matters to attend to. I will leave you in the capable hands of Mr. Keephart right now. He writes with good hand, and he will see to that your needs are met this evening." And without a word, the Reverend Pry put on his coat and skittered out the door. After the Reverend left, Mr. Keephart sat down in front of us. I noticed he had breadcrumbs stuck to the front of his shirt, and his sleeves of his worn coat reached barely to his elbows. "Pleased to meet you," he nodded and smiled with domino teeth grin at Harrison. "Don't mind if I ask you a few questions?" But then he went on and asked Harrison about 101 things, it seemed. "How many masses have you had in your life? What were they like? Had the masses let him attend church from time to time? Was he treated well or roughly? Was he fed proper meals or given good clothes or boots for the winter? Whatever did they ever beat or cowhide him?" It seemed downright curious to me that the Reverend Pry's congregation would be so interested in the lives of black folks. Master Hackley and Miss Catherine would have fallen out into a fit if they knew Mr. Keephart wrote down a whole page of words about Harrison. He even asked if he could have a look at his scars on his back. "They ain't some picture to look at," Harrison said, pressing his lips together and giving Mr. Keephart a stare. "But I could show you what they's like, I suppose." Standing up, he took off his coat and lifted up his shirt so Mr. Keephart could see them. I kept my eyes fixed at the table and listened to him whisper, "Oh, terrible, terrible sight." And then I heard Harrison say, calm as anything, "Now let me get a look at your back, Mr. Keephart."